Alrighty, in this particular video, we are going to be disassembling our Lenovo M910s desktop. If we look at the front of this particular desktop, we're going to see that it has front panel USB, front panel audio for mic and headphones, as well as a power button. And then we're also going to notice that there is no DVD drive in this particular model, but it does have the ability to install a DVD drive. On the back side of this computer, we're also going to see that it has two thumb screws to disassemble the top panel on this, or the side panel. And then we'll also notice that this one in particular actually has something that's not necessarily as common anymore, which is a PS2 keyboard and mouse. So not something you typically see on a lot of the desktops anymore because it's been replaced in favor of USB devices, but it does exist in this one, and we are going to have to remove it in order to disassemble the computer and remove the motherboard. Now, in the case of the thumb screws, in a lot of places, you're going to notice that they're probably going to be too tight to remove with your finger the first time. However, that's because when they were put on, someone had actually installed them using a screwdriver. Now, the idea of thumb screws is just to be thumb tight. So for labs and the fact that you're going to be opening up your computer probably a lot, it's advised that you're going to want to just thumb tight these. That way you can open it later on and you're not going to have to worry about it too much. Now, off camera, I've actually gone ahead and powered this computer on and verified that it works. However, it's advised to you to make sure that it does function before disassembly, especially if you're told that it works, only for the fact that sometimes in transportation, computers can have issues, and it's always important to know what your starting ground is. If the computer's working, if it's not working, you want to know that. So in this case, I've actually turned this computer on off camera, and I've gone ahead afterwards and unplugged all of the cables. Whenever we're working inside of the desktop, we want to make sure we're unplugging everything, not just the power, especially if we're disassembling things, unplug everything. That way there's no chance of power being fed into it in any way. On the front side of this computer, after we've unplugged it from power, you're going to want to hold the power button down for about 5 to 10 seconds to ensure that there's no residual power left in the power supply. In some computers, you'll actually notice there's an LED indicator on the motherboard, and that indicator will be used to drain the power down over time. Now, to disassemble this PC, we are going to need a toolkit. In this particular case, this toolkit is just an 11-piece StarTech toolkit. Nothing fancy. Really, all we need and desire is just a simple Phillips screwdriver head. And we also have our anti-static wrist strap. Now, to use our anti-static wrist strap, it's actually fairly simple. All we need to do is just go ahead and unclip or clip the snap in if it's not there and you want to adjust it. So we snap that on, and then it's just an elastic band that actually goes over your wrist like so. And then on the other end, you have an alligator clip that you can clip onto any piece of unpainted surface. So after we take the side panel off, we can go ahead and clip it onto this back ledge here, or even possibly onto this little ring there on the back edge. And that allows us to work safely inside the machine, and that ensures that any static potential between us and the desktop has been removed. We're going to become common with the desktop. So to open this up, we're going to go ahead first and get our Phillips screwdriver. So we're going to use one of the larger Phillips screwdrivers, which you can see here, just to pop these two screws off. The nice thing about these is you just need to loosen them a little bit, and then the rest can be done with your hand. Now this one's actually pretty tight. There we go. So we've gone ahead and we've loosened those. So now we can use our fingers just to remove them. And we're going to go ahead and put these off to the side. Now in this particular toolkit I actually have a little nifty bottle to put my screws into, so we can go ahead and we can put our two thumb screws in there. There's nothing special about them. They're going to be fairly easy to identify later on. And we're going to slide the back of this case this way. So sliding that off, removing the panel, and putting it off to the side. Now in this particular case, you're going to notice when you look in here some different points that are with red. You're going to notice little iconography that's printed onto the actual metal or stamped into it. And in this particular case, it looks like we need to press this forward and this needs to flip up. Now, before we can actually do that in this particular small form factor, we actually have to pull the front panel off. So before I continue any further, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clip onto the back. using my anti-static bracelet. Now I think right there is probably going to be the best place for now. So to pop the front panel off, simply just pulling on those 3 tabs you see there with the red markings, and it actually just rotates towards the front of the case. So it rotates off and flips off, and we can put that off to the side now. So now that we have that off to the side, we can go ahead and continue. Let me just zoom out a little bit. Perfect. So now that we continue, we can actually press this little red in and give it a little push. Sometimes you're going to push the way you don't want it to go. So in this case, I'm pushing a little bit to close it just so I can press on this latch and release it from the case. And then the whole front of this case actually spins out. There we go. So the whole front of this case spins out now. So now I have access inside the case to the power supply, the CPU cooler, we got the motherboard, the hard drive is going to be in the front. We got a whole bunch of different power connectors throughout the case. And I think the first thing that's important is obviously removing the stuff that we easily can get access to and removing the connectors off the motherboard. Because the motherboard and the power supply are probably going to be near the end, most likely. So removing the little shroud around the CPU cooler will make it a little bit easier to work with. And now in this particular case, it's not always the case, but in this particular one, we actually have a few zip ties. Now I took the liberty of sort of doing a quick examination first, but you are going to either need a pair of wire cutters, or you're going to have to borrow a pair of wire cutters. And you're going to need to cut very carefully without cutting the wires, of course, the zip tie on the front of the case that's holding in those. And then the other zip tie is actually over on the side, and actually it's right here. So this other zip tie is on the power wires, and it's zip tying a bunch of the other connectors to it. So similarly, very carefully, we're just going to clip that second zip tie off the power wires. So now that that's done, put those wire cutters off to the side because we're not going to need them anymore. So now we got our cooler visible, we got our PS2 keyboard and mouse visible, and then we got some other connectors. So first things first, I think we should go ahead and remove the hard drive. So the hard drive is removed simply by just pressing on this little red lever, sliding it towards the back of the case, and pulling the hard drive out. Very carefully, you're going to want to grip onto the power connector for SATA and the data connector for SATA, and you're going to want to remove that. So generally, I hold on to it, and then I'm actually pressing with my thumb against the side of the hard drive to pull it off straight. We don't want to be wiggling it from the top to the bottom of the drive. We want to be just pulling it off of the end. That way we're not going to damage the SATA connections. Because if those crack, they are going to break and they're no longer going to be usable. So now that we removed our SATA data and our SATA power from our computer, we can go ahead and we can work on something a little bit more now. So in this case here, we're going to remove our SATA power cord by simply gripping the bottom of the connector with our thumb and index finger, squeezing and pulling upwards. And we're going to set that cable off to the side. We're going to perform the same action again with our SATA data cable. We're going to take a quick observation to see where it's plugged into. In this case here, looking at the silk screen, it shows that it's plugged into SATA 1. We're going to grip the connector same way. There's going to be metal on one side. Pressing that and pulling straight up, there should be no resistance there. And that's removed now. Next up, we're going to go ahead and we're going to remove some of the other cables. So in this case here, we got our speaker connector, so the mono speaker, which is just hanging up on the front. Its cable comes over here to the far right of the front of the case. Grabbing the connector, pulling straight up, it should be fairly easy to disconnect. On the right-hand side, there's a little wire clip. We can press that downward or upwards, depending on how the style is. In this case here, it looks like it's one way or the other way, and it pops off. There we go. And then on the front here, we have our power button and our LED indicator, which are hanging out right here. They just plug into the motherboard right in front of it. So that's a fairly easy connector, same thing. Grabbing it as close as we can to the connector. These sometimes you got to give a little bit of a wiggle side to side just to loosen the connection, but it does disconnect fairly easily. Next up, we're going to disconnect our thermal sensor from the front of the computer, and we're going to disconnect our Think Center LED. For some reason, this computer has a Think Center LED into the logo. And you can see that if you actually look at the front panel right here. This little indicator light is what lights up when the computer powers on. So we're going to go ahead, same thing as before. We're going to grab the green connector, which is our thermal sensor, pulling straight up. And then we're going to grab the indicator LED and pull straight up. Those as well should be fairly easy to remove. So now that all we have left in our case is our PS2 connector in the back. So same thing. Let me just zoom the camera out a little bit. It's hanging out all the way back here next to the back of the computer case. Same thing. This one's fairly easy, just lifting slowly straight up. And that makes for that. And then next up, we have our RAM we can remove, and we have our 2 power connectors. So actually, let's get our power connectors out of the way first. So what we can do is we can go ahead and we can remove our 4-pin CPU auxiliary power connector. Now it is clipped to the side of the case, so we're going to have to press that little clip a little bit just to disconnect that, and we're going to pull that off to the side. Same thing as well, we have our motherboard power connector. Now this particular power supply we're going to learn about later on in the semester is an ATX 12-volt power connector. So it's not your typical 24-pin power connector, but it gets removed the same way. We press on the clip on the one side. Now this one typically tends to need a little bit more force. So jiggling it side to side while you're pressing and pulling at the same time is usually enough to get that to remove itself. So now that that's all said and done, we're going to go ahead and remove the RAM. RAM in this particular case, you're going to press the releasing arms on the left and right hand side. And when you do so, the RAM will make an audible sort of clicking sound as it comes up, and then you should be able to remove it with both fingers very carefully from the outside. Now when you're removing the RAM, you want to try to avoid touching any of the contacts on the edge, just because that is going to possibly cause damage to the computer over time. So we're going to put the RAM off to the side now. So now that's all that's left is our CPU cooler, the CPU cooler connector, and our power supply. Now we're going to remove the 4-pin from that. And part of the reason why I've actually left the cooler on at this particular point is mainly for the fact that there is thermal paste on the bottom of it and there is some on the top of it. You can remove the CPU cooler earlier if you like. It's just important that you make sure you clean it first before you continue. That way you don't have wires that are going to fall into the thermal paste and make a bit of a mess everywhere. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to remove the power supply next. Now the power supply is fairly easy. On the back of the computer case, we have 3 Phillips screws. They are case style screws. And we can actually use that exact same screwdriver we previously used to remove the thumb screws. So just making quick wind of all 3 of those. Okay, perfect. So now we've removed those 3 screws. Now one thing you're going to want to note, and there will be a picture online, that there is a difference between the threads. So make sure that you do pay attention that these threads are very coarse and they are case screws. Because once we start removing the motherboard screws, you're going to notice that those look very similar. So now that we've disconnected the screws from the back of the power supply, we can go ahead. Inside the computer case, there's actually a little tiny latch that we press on. And as we press on it, we're going to very carefully pull the power supply or push the power supply from the back into the case. Now you're going to want to be careful because as you're pressing, if you push too hard, you're actually going to pinch your finger underneath that clip. So now that the power supply is removed, we can go ahead and put that off to the side. And that leaves us with 2 things really. Our cooler that needs to be removed, the motherboard that needs to be removed, and actually there's a few other little smaller things which we can deal with afterwards, like the speaker in the front of the case that needs to be removed and the thermal sensor. But the motherboard's going to be a little bit more work. And also, we got to remove our PS2 connector from the back. So I think what we should do next is actually we're going to remove that, and we're going to remove the speaker. That way, the last few things we're working on, we don't have to worry about the motherboard being disconnected or things having the ability to be moved around. So on the back of the computer case, as I mentioned before, these are just simply 2 Phillips screws. Exact same screwdriver we previously were able to use. It's the exact same one that can be used again. Now that's the really nice thing about this particular model, is that every one of these screws accepts a fairly stubby Phillips screwdriver. You don't need to have anything pointy or anything fancy, and just like that, we've gone ahead and we've removed our PS2 connector. So we can go ahead and put that off to the side now. Now in this particular case, I think I said we were going to remove the speaker next. So turning the computer on its side, coming back to the front. If we look at the front, we can actually see, and we might even have to close it a little bit to see, being careful not to pinch the wires, because that's a good way to break them. When we come to the front, you're going to actually notice that the speaker has a little clip that you just press and it pops out, and the exact same thing with the thermal sensor. You just press the clip and it also pops out. And you'll notice it even fell into the computer case. That's how light the pressure is required in order to take those 2 things out. So thermal sensor is now removed, off to the side, and our speaker is also removed, and we're going to put that off to the side. Now, other than that, the only other thing that may get in the way is our power button. Similarly, our power button on the front here, if we close this, being careful of our fingers now, our power button on the front is very similar. It's flush, but it's kind of right above the motherboard, so it might get in the way. Now, we also see as well, looking at the front area, there's actually another Phillips screw up front. So this whole front section can actually come unscrewed. And the cool thing about it is this is also a case screw, and simply removing it again is going to work wonders. And this slides to the left like that, and you're going to notice it kind of has a bit of a hinge way. And look at that. Our power button and the front panel protection for the USB and the front panel audio has now been easily removed. Now those other screws I left off to the side, but we should definitely go ahead and put them away. So we're putting away that front case screw, and we're going to put away those 2 back screws for the PS2 connection. Now another nifty way of holding onto these screws would be something like this. It's like a little pill container. You can actually hold your screws in it fairly easily, and you can buy them pretty much everywhere. And it helps keep them separated and organized. Okay, so now that we've done that, there's really not much left in this computer case other than the cooler, the motherboard, and that little indicator LED. Now, unfortunately, that little indicator LED, I never did actually find an easy enough way to remove it without the possibility of damaging, so we're going to go ahead and leave that in there. But our cooler now we can go ahead and remove, simply by performing a star technique. So a little bit of this screw, 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 and then basically cycling around that over and over and over again until it becomes loose and comes off. Now the reason why we're performing this technique is because we actually want the entire cooler to come off of the board evenly. We don't want it to rock on the CPU, and we don't want it to put undue stress on certain screw points, because that can cause damage. And it looks like actually I'm almost done. There's just a couple little ones left. And when you try to lift it up a little bit, you'll notice it gets hung, and if it does, just take the rest of the screws off. So on the bottom of our CPU cooler, you're going to notice that there's actually some thermal paste. We're going to very carefully put this upside down, off to the side. Now before we remove our CPU, a lot of you are going to want to jump into that. I would suggest removing the motherboard first. And the reason being is because if we remove the CPU, we're going to want to clean it, you're going to have an open socket, we still got to remove screws. So it's important that the CPU is the last step that we can perform. So let's go ahead and remove all of the screws from the motherboard. And there's a lot of screws. We got one over to the right of the M.2, we got one next to the SATA connection, we got 2 in the front next to the USB, we got a couple hanging out at the back, and we got some hanging out underneath the clips for the RAM slots. Now, it's always important when you are removing these motherboard screws that you do keep them at least mentally noted what they look like, because the threads on these are a lot thinner and they're not the same as the case screws. And the other thing as well to note is that sometimes these motherboard screws do have a tendency to hide in places you don't expect. There we go, got that one. So sometimes you got to pull open clips and look very carefully, because if you forget one, you're not going to be able to get that motherboard out without damaging it, if at all. In some cases, I have seen people break the motherboards out of the case, and we definitely don't want to be doing that. Okay. So now we've gone ahead and we've removed all the screws, and in this particular case there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 screws. We're going to go ahead and put those aside. And when we put those back in, you're going to also want to make a mental note of where they were, because you're also going to have your CPU cooler that's going to be screwed in using 4 of these screw holes. So you're not going to want to put them in the wrong spots. So now that we've removed all of the screws, we got our case completely emptied. The next thing we're going to want to do is very carefully, and I like to sometimes grab on these little power connectors that have a little bit more beef. You're going to grab the motherboard, and it should be fairly loose. So when we grab it, lift up a little bit, give it a little wiggle, make sure it's loose, and then you're going to slide it forward, and then you're going to grab it from the back very carefully, and you're going to just slide it up and out like that. So now we have an empty computer case. As you can see, there is nothing inside that case, and we just have our motherboard. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put that computer case off to the side, and we're going to continue on. Now in this particular case, there's really not many places that you can safely clip off to. Sometimes they'll actually clip off to the connectors on the back of the board if you were doing some sort of detailed repair. However, in this particular case, we're not going to be running around and we're not going to be generating static electricity, so we should be fairly good. So first things first, we're going to remove our CPU. Now to remove our CPU, a lot of people oftentimes, and let me just remove my anti-static wrist strap. And let's zoom in a little bit. Perfect. A lot of times people are going to want to just simply remove this screw, and that's not the way this is done. This particular connector is what's referred to as a ZIF, or a zero insertion force. So simply holding onto the socket a little bit, we're just going to remove this arm by pressing it to the right, lifting it up, spinning it around, and then it flops open like that. And when we go to grab it, on the top and the bottom here, you're actually going to notice that there's a little bit of a finger hole. So we can simply grab it between our thumb and our index finger, and if you have nails, it's a little bit easier, but you're going to grab it, you're going to lift straight up, and you're going to put it off to the side. Now you're going to want to make sure, obviously, before you put a CPU back in there, that there's nothing there. And we have our CPU here, like so. Let's get that to focus. There we go. So when we're looking at our CPU, you'll actually notice there's some little notches. So right there, and you're going to notice that gold arrow in the one side. That's going to help you realign it to put it back into the socket. Now in order to clean the CPU and to clean the heatsink, we're actually just going to use some isopropanol alcohol. Now in this case here, it's in a nifty spray bottle, but you can actually get it in many different form factors. You can get it in little bottles from the drugstore, and we're going to use a little bit of paper towel, and we're going to spray the paper towel, and we're going to take it and we're going to clean it. And my greatest analogy is it's like you're helping your parents and you're cleaning pots and pans. So you're going to take it and you're going to rub in a circular pattern near the edges. You're going to want to run perpendicular and parallel to them to try to get as much of the loose stuff off as possible. And as you perform those actions, you want to make sure you're not touching the bottom of the chip. And if it has a bit of gets a little bit saturated with gunk, simply just turning it around and then flipping it back works pretty good. So let me just zoom out again so you can see. So simply cleaning our CPU just like some pots and pans. And you might notice that our table gets a little messy. So actually we can put it that way since this is a wood table, it's non-conductive. But next up we're going to want to clean our cooler. Now simply just folding our paper towel inside out a few times. If we need to, we can get a little bit more alcohol to freshen that up. And we're going to take our cooler, and the only part that matters is this little center part. In this particular one, it's actually really nice since it's raised. So same thing, cleaning it just like our pots and pans, giving it a little scrub, scrub, scrub. And as you can see, it's all nice and clean now. It's not going to look perfect. It's going to look a little bit tarnished, and that's all right. And then with our paper towel at the very end, we're going to want to make sure we clean up our desk area. That way we're not transferring thermal paste everywhere. And if we did happen to get any on our hands, you're going to want to make sure you just clean that up. It's not something that's going to harm you immediately, but it's definitely not something that you want to ingest. All right, so just like that, we have disassembled our desktop computer. Now in the class, you're going to want to go ahead and call over your professor before you go ahead and insert the CPU back into the socket. And the main reason for that is to make sure that you are doing it correctly and that nothing is going to be damaged. But just to kind of give you the rundown of how this is going to work, when you hold onto your CPU, just like when you removed it, you're going to want to make sure your board is orientated the correct way. When you're looking at the actual socket itself, you're going to notice there's a little arrow on it that you can actually orientate as well. And that little arrow aligns with the arrow on the CPU. So you grab it, you're going to put it down like that. Simple as that. You're going to grab the socket, you're going to flip the bottom portion down first, so that way it hooks underneath the screw, and you're going to press it down like so. So now our CPU is secured in the socket. It's really important that before you put the socket down that you ensure the CPU is correctly installed. Incorrectly inserting the CPU is going to possibly and most likely cause irreversible damage to the socket or to the CPU itself. So now that that's done, our CPU has been inserted in front of the professor. We're going to go ahead and put our motherboard back into our case. And if for some reason your bracket came off the back of the motherboard, you're going to want to make sure that this bracket, which is used to secure the cooler onto the motherboard, is reinstalled back in the same place. So bringing back our computer case, zooming back out. So bringing back our computer case, the exact same way we put it in. We're going to slide our front panel in first, and then we're going to sit it down.